So if we can, we'll just have you,
Thanks, Joe.
I'll start. I'm Dick Snellman, one of the commissioners in the county. If you wanna go, we'll just go around.
Brian Kozelby, Teton County Planner / floodplain management.
Harold Yeager, property owner.
Kirk Moore, property owner.
Hannah Schultz, DNRC Outreach. Monica Conlon, hydrologist for DNRC.
Doug Bruger, engineer for DNRC.
Kevin Doyle with Michael Baker, we're a study contractor.
Liam Books, also with Michael Baker.
John Connors with DNRC.
Joe Dell, Commissioner.
Chief Van Sutton, Teton County Sheriff and property owner.
Kevin Englund, planner and floodplain administrator, Great West Engineering.
Ross Salmon, Teton County Conservation District and property owner.
Joe Haas, property owner.
Andrew Fry.
Thanks for coming. You got everything.
Just, I know most of you have been here before, but this is a Facebook live stream that will be archived then on the Choteau web or Facebook page.
It looks like Chris Hindeman's on.
Yeah, we have some online, so if you don't mind going down and introducing yourself.
Good afternoon, meeting Wadsworth, DNRC floodplain.
I'm Chris Hindeman, I'm the mayor of the city of Choteau.
Jerry Gerbanks with Great West Engineering. We are helping the city with floodplain administration and planning.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jason Isherwood, also from Michael Baker.
Thanks everyone for coming. So Doug, I guess I'll just turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm not just tech support, I'm also an engineer with DNRC. I need to get moved over so I can see the slides too. I'll be kind of moving through these slides and leading the discussion today, but we'll be hearing from some other folks as part of the presentation, and of course we'll want to be having a conversation with everybody along the way as well. So we'll just get started. So thanks everybody for attending today. As was brought up a couple times in a couple of the virtual meetings so far, it sure pays off to meet in person and be able to have these conversations together. So really grateful for everybody coming here today. And the first slide here on the agenda, the only thing I'll sort of add or note is that this has changed a bit relative to the agenda that we sent out, more or less still the same. So that schedule has shifted somewhat. We don't need to stick to the schedule very strictly, but it'll help us keep on target and make sure we cover all the topics that we want to cover today. And so first we're gonna do another round of introductions, at least on the DNRC side, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what we hope to get out of today's meeting. Then we'll dive into the technical material that we prepared for about an hour there, but we'll take it easy and have a lot of breaks for Q&A. And then we've made sure we've got steps, time blocked off at the end so we can talk about next steps. So we've done quick introductions around the room. I think we pretty well covered it, so I suppose we'll zip by this. And we've had an opportunity to meet a couple times virtually too, but I'll just ask maybe if folks ask questions or have comments, don't be shy to remind folks who you are on either side of the conversation here. So on to, well, I guess I might want to move that corner out of the way. And hopefully it doesn't break everything. Okay, I think that should work. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, we put together these PowerPoint slides. That's how these meetings always go, right? That's that's partly, to get some things out there explicitly. It's so that these slides will be available after the fact. So we'll use these to guide the discussion. But step one, we figured, was make sure we're on the same page about why we're here. And the first point of action is make sure the community's concerns about the flow calculations are clear, right? And then we'll take some time discussing that. Want to go around and make sure we haven't missed anything. Then we'll be stepping into explaining the flow calculations more, how they were determined. We had to go through that pretty quick in our February meeting, so that's the bulk of what we prepared today. And then why I'm bringing that up is that you'll hear us throw around the term hydrology for the flow calculations. We'll try to default to flow calculations, but that's to distinguish from hydraulics. It's more of a technical term, but that's more about the delineation of the maps. And so that's not intended to be the focus of today's meeting. We can talk about that certainly, but we're starting with probably the most important step, which is where did these flow calculations come from? Any concerns, particularly about say the hydraulics, are things we can follow up later if we don't end up having time to address them today. Oh. I need a click just to get the slideshow back. There we go. See if that works. Click it over down. Okay. And as we are also recording the meeting, and I think we'll make the recording available on our website, or at the very least available for download. Also saves us cramps on taking minutes. So just FYI, slides recording will be available later. So we took a stab at listing out what the community's concerns are. And I think in a nutshell, the main concern is that the flows are too high, that we're used to develop those maps. I added a couple of sort of details based on our conversation so far. How can this Teton River that normally sees the highest flow of 1,000 CFS or less, cubic feet per second, is expected to have 23,000 CFS in a flood? Where did that number come from? What kinds of assumptions went into digging a little deeper as far as summarizing the community's concerns? What kind of assumptions went into those calculations? What type of storm event fed those calculations? Are we accounting for loss to groundwater? So let me make sure. Yeah, I can go back a slide to see if to have those sort of as prompts. But we thought we'd use this whiteboard up here to list off any other concerns that we didn't include on that last slide. And just as a heads up, we have specific slides in here where we'll break often for Q&A. So you're not going to hear us talk for 90 straight minutes and then have the Q&A session. We'll break regularly and try to answer questions topic by topic as we go. So if we feel like that's captured it well enough, we can continue, but were there any other concerns that we want to make sure we address today? If folks have any off the top of their head, we can put them on this extra whiteboard, was the thinking. I also like stretching my legs. We were just in the car for 2 hours.
Peter Fritz, the water commissioner, I spoke with him this morning. He was supposed to jump online. He might jump on here shortly. He wanted to know why the recorded water absorption rate was not included in the calculations. I think that was just the general gist of his question. Is that correct, Ross? Ross?
What's that?
Was that about?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just general bullet up here that we'll make sure we get back to if we don't cover it in the slides.
And then I think you've already covered it, the 16,000 current flood rate or CFS flow is now jumping almost 50% to 23,840, I think it is. I know that the Conservation District did a survey in 2022 that stated that would be the new flow, and that flow hasn't changed, but I think it was explained to me that the LiDAR is just a better version of the ground.
Okay. Okay.
So how did you guys calculate? It looks like you guys got it, the calculations for the type of storm event and loss of groundwater.
Okay, this type of storm event, sure. Okay. We also won't necessarily go back to that slide, so it's good to put it up here for
This is
future
Peter
reference.
Fritsch, I am on the line.
Oh, did I cover your question correctly? And was there another one?
Yeah, you covered it correctly.
Okay.
I have questions. I don't know if it's whiteboard or you, but when you get into this, how, I think mine are in the line with the how. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole separately if you go in there.
No, that's great. And I'll, we'll bring this up again later, but we brought some flash drives with the calculations that went in, you know, the whole calculation package. We have those that are available to take with. You can also email us and download them later, but that's something we'll remind again at the end of the meeting.
Or maybe you covered this before. What data you used or what you had available to come up with the 23,000?
And I would have questions that would tie into that as well.
Okay, perfect. We'll have time, yeah, to refine these later on. Anybody else online or anybody else have some things to add? We can add more to these later too. All right. No, thanks everybody. Put me on the spot a bit. But we should better cover as many questions as we can while we're here today. Okay. So, still in kind of this overview phase, I wanted to cover again some of the background of why map flood risk, why dive into these things. I think we're all pretty well on the same page here, so I'm not gonna.
Actually, a question on that.
Oh, sure,
just,
sure.
Just again at a high level, but so is this, who's driving this? Is this the state? Is this FEMA? And what is the nature of the relationship between you and FEMA? And yeah, so let's start there.
That's a great question. I think I've basically got that covered on the next slide. So let's start here. This is a pretty busy slide. Let's go through it together rather than me just summarize it. But when you've got these floodplain maps, which I'm going to go back and talk a little bit more about that motivation here in a second. The state of Montana, as under a nationwide FEMA program that supports these mapping updates, the state of Montana directs the mapping updates to all over the state, depending on a handful of factors. Basically, the statewide, pretty much everybody's in the queue for getting a floodplain mapping update. There was a bit of a lull in sort of that rhythm over the course of the 2000s and into the early 2010s. That'd be another can of worms. But since roughly 2016-17, we've had a big push across the state to update floodplain maps for a lot of counties and east to west.
Is that legislative, or is that the executive order? What is the, when you say we, what is the we?
So let me take it back just a little bit further than that. So back in the 70s, I think we all know there was major floods that happened kind of in that mid-70 range. After those floods, Montana recognized that they needed to map the risk associated with these floodplains in Montana. And so there was a big push during that period, late 70s, early 80s, to get all these floodplain maps out. They did a great job. They're all throughout the state. There's a lot of communities that's still the active maps. As those progressed into the future, they're useful for a good period of time, but as time has passed, we've recognized, hey, both we need to update these using more modern techniques, and we recognize that the old maps they're just getting outdated, and that's kind of across the state. So what has happened, DNRC does, and I don't know the exact language in MCAs, but it says DNRC will, you're gonna have to help me out here, Doug, basically pursue floodplain mapping.
Yeah, and we do have, that'll sort of roll into the next steps conversation at the end of the presentation as well. I think questions of what's the basis for these floodplain maps. We might drill into that in a little more detail later.
Okay.
But great question, and I did touch on it here where it was around 2020. DNRC under this program communicated with Teton County and said, let's get a floodplain mapping update going across the county. So we get letters of support in all the counties where we kick off these projects. And of course, this support is given without yet knowing what the new maps will look like. It's before we've done any of the analysis. And so that's kind of been the path to today. So it takes a while to...
We didn't talk about FEMA though. Ask, what's the relationship between FEMA and DNRC in this process?
We'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
So this timeline is a long one. That's just how these projects work. So we had about 3 years of quiet, you could say, while data was getting collected and models were being developed. And throughout 2023, we call it draft data, just because it's got still a long way to go through the regulatory process. But this is after the data's been through a lot of QA/QC, a lot of review, is when we started to, show the community. And kind of adding some detail through here that was just sort of for to be on the thorough side. The increase in the 1% floodplain prompted community concerns towards the late summer, early fall 2023. You guys are familiar with that. We were aware of that. We had this meeting in October. It's sort of a technical term. This flood risk review is a required meeting for these floodplain mapping updates. And so that was one of the first times we came together to discuss some of these community concerns with the increased size of the floodplain. And we initiated additional review of the studies at that time to ensure accuracy and address some of these concerns. And that's what led to another virtual meeting in February, where we talked sort of big picture about the project results and talked about an update on that review that we initiated. And it was at that meeting we announced that our review didn't determine that there was no change expected to the flow calculations. And then a lot of the specific concerns that we've been discussing today is sort of what prompted today's meeting. And then also using this slide to look ahead, we'll have our meeting in a month. That is an open house for property owners for discussion specific to individual properties. So that will be under the assumption that the maps are going forward. That's, let's just assuming that, then the intent of that open house is informational for individual property owners. So back to the role of the floodplain mapping, some of that timeline, and a little bit of this concept of the 100-year flood, or what we prefer to call the 1% annual chance flood, or the 1% flood. So in a big picture sense, both with Choteau and around the state, I don't think anybody disagrees with whether or not floods happen, right? So we've got some photos from the 1964 flood. Some personal background for me. I've never lived in a community that's experienced a 1% flood. My dad grew up in Great Falls. His dad was the press foreman for the Great Falls Tribune for many decades. He saw the 1964 flood in person affect the neighborhoods in the west side of Great Falls there. Also, my team at DNRC assisted in recovery of a 500-year flood in 2022. Some others at DNRC assisted in recovery of the 2011 flood. Some of that recovery is still ongoing. Of course, the 2022 flood recovery is still ongoing. And while I'm sort of taking a detour to add a personal touch here, we deal a lot as a state agency with this balance between any individual community having a 1% chance of a flood next year. You probably won't have your 100-year flood this year. We already know that because of the snowpack. And if you wanted to bet me next year, will this 1% flood happen on the Teton River? You're going to win that bet 99% of the time, right? But at the state level, as you can see, 2022, 2011, we see one of these floods damage a community about once every 10 years, right? So it isn't a 100-year flood to us anymore. I've got a 10% chance going into 2025 that me and my team, not to mention DES and the local DES coordinators, the local floodplain administrators, somewhere in the state might have to mobilize for a 100-year flood. I've got a 10% chance of that any given year, roughly speaking. So it's a tricky balance, and the impacts of these maps are severe. And Choteau has seen with these new maps some of the biggest, amounts of your structures in floodplains, and it's a big consequence. But I just wanted to reiterate for the record, on a personal note, that the impacts of those floods are catastrophic, regardless of the impacts of these maps. So that's my personal motivation for developing these maps. When it comes to the state, John already alluded to the state, largely as a reaction to the 1964 floods, put laws in place mandating the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation specifically with maintaining and updating the state's floodplain mapping portfolio. And then the FEMA layer on top of that is mostly tied to those regulatory FEMA maps, which take a tiny detour here, but we have some communities in the state that regulate to maps that aren't from FEMA, but those FEMA maps are predominantly the main regulatory tool. So it's sort of a complicated partnership, the state, the community, and FEMA. But in order for the community to participate in what's called the National Flood Insurance Program, you need to agree to regulate to the FEMA maps. And there's not a really explicit requirement for a timeline for updating those maps, but there is a regulatory requirement that those maps need to get updated on a regular basis. And I mean, actually the timing is 5 years before they say that a floodplain map is technically outdated, but it takes a lot longer than that to get a floodplain map in place. I'll take a breath here. Maybe see Kevin if you wanted to add a little to the sort of
Layers?
Yeah, the FEMA, state, and local layers.
Yeah, so to answer your question, FEMA manages the National Flood Insurance Program. So in part of managing that is they identify flood risk nationwide. And they've done that, as John mentioned, since actually started in the late 60s. So they'll go year over year and look at where maps are outdated and update that flood risk. The state is a cooperating technical partner with FEMA, which means they have more control over what studies are done and where. In some locations, I'll use the state of South Dakota for an example. They do not have a cooperating technical partner program, so FEMA just chooses where the studies are going to be done and manages them and picks their own contractors. By the state becoming a partner with FEMA, they get more control. They've got a whole bullpen of contractors, Great West, Dowell, Michael Baker, others, that they can assign to those studies and decide when the studies are done, where they're done, and who actually does it. So that's how the different layers work. Did that explain enough, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do have one question. So, 40 years since we had our last update. What specific event or what events have sparked the state of Montana to push for the revision?
That's a great question, and the
So
short
is it
answer.
the Yellowstone Park?
No,
was
it's just the fact that your maps are paper essentially. So, as Kevin mentioned, becoming a cooperating technical partner was an explicit step in this whole process. It occurred in 2005, and since then, the priority has predominantly been to have communities no longer be dependent on these paper maps. So obviously in the 90s, the 80s, that was the only option. But as the technology advanced, this community won't be as familiar with the National Flood Hazard Layer, which is a website you can go to. So communities that have had the update can go to a website, type in their address, similar to the R viewer that we've put together, and use that as a tool to regulate their floodplains. So Teton is one of the increasingly shrinking number of counties that currently use only paper maps for their regulatory products.
And this is being done nationwide, so all the states around Montana are doing the same thing. Colorado, North Dakota, Wyoming. They're looking at what you'll find nationwide is there were a bunch of maps that were created in the late 70s and early 80s when FEMA had a bunch of funding. And then FEMA's funding kind of went down because they mapped the nation. We don't need to fund FEMA to the same level. And so those maps went unupdated for a long period of time. And then FEMA got an increased level of funding in the early 2000s to start to modernize the program and develop digital flood data and restudy areas that haven't been studied in 30 or 40 years.
So one of the questions is going to come up, or I'd like to ask this question because I know this is going to come up down the road. So you mentioned 5 years. So now that we have this new LiDAR data, are we looking at the state of Montana pushing for revised NFIP mapping to FEMA every 5 years? Because we can actually do it much faster now, correct?
No, yeah, that's a bit of inside baseball number that was confusing for me to throw out. But FEMA has a tool that they use to report to Congress, and 5 years is the timeline that they use to say, within 5 years they look at Teton County's maps and say those maps are good, nobody needs to touch them. At the 5 year mark, they just sort of automatically get toggled to ready for a restudy, but in practice, I really see this as another big push of mapping both nationwide and within Montana. More than likely, the next mapping updates at this scale will be in another couple of decades from now, and it won't be at something like a 5 year scale.
Okay.
When you say a big push, I don't know of anybody around Choteau or Teton County that has asked for this study. So who's pushing?
That's a good point. it's
we don't know if we need it. Things change as we go. They're building a new highway up here now. That new highway is going to have some effect on the high water in Choteau? Is that taken into consideration? And I took pictures this morning
Yeah.
of Teton. There's no channel. I mean, you gotta have a channel to put this water to go someplace, and there's been not much done about it. There's places where there just basically is none. What you guys are talking about is the problem. The cause is up above us. That's what's causing this to happen in the matter that it is. I've worked with them on Spring Creek. Tried to get it cleaned out to where it can take some water to get rid of it. Right now, the culverts are 4 to 6/10 below the water down a couple hundred feet down from the culverts. That's a problem. That's a big problem. And there's trash in the creeks. If you want to prevent a flood, that's one of the things you have to look at.
No.
We know you're going to get some high water, but I know some of the pushback that I've got on it is from the Fish and Game. And it just don't make sense to me.
I think you're absolutely right. And let me try to rephrase this just a little bit. I mean, you're right in that there are things that can be done to, mitigate some of this risk. And what this whole project is to identify that risk, and to know what areas are vulnerable, what areas could, where work could be done to help alleviate some of this. But until the problem is known, or until you can measure that problem, where do you put that? I mean, which culvert might it be? Is it better to look at doing something on this piece of creek? So this is the first step in that process. And unfortunately, yeah, it's a long process and there's a lot of hurdles to try to get some stuff done. But if we know what it is, then you can start those conversations with folk, whether it be FWP, MDT, local groups, whatever. But you have this in place. Say, yeah, this is our problem. How can we fix it? What's going to be the best use for money?
So the Highway 89 North project they will submit a LOMAR when the project's completed. And all that, of course, will be another map revision. And we have Highway 89 South along with the new bridge going in. That will have another LOMAR, which will be another map revision. So we've still got 2 more down the road before this even goes into effect.
That's a good point. And I was going to mention that the full study process of FEMA takes a long time. I mean, it's 5+ years to get through the whole study process to get the county-wide maps updated. But if you're doing a project that's going to change the flood risk, be it new bridges, new culverts, channelization, stuff like that, FEMA has another process called the letter of map revision process, which is a much quicker process to get the flood risk updated. You're talking a smaller scale, so you're talking a bridge project, but generally it's like 6 months to get through that process.
Yeah. No, it's no. Thanks for the conversation and thanks for expressing the concern that for as much as we have our state level role in this, it doesn't feel community driven in a lot of ways. Our effort to address that is to communicate with the community, make sure that there's awareness that the update is happening, get support from a handful of stakeholders, including county commissioners, but that's the extent of the floodplain maps at the end of the day get updated on a regular basis, and that's where we're at in the process for Teton County. So several points I think that we will come back to. I think we've kind of covered question and answer for this sort of overview, but I'd be happy to come back to some of these points a little bit later. Let's get moving. I'm actually doing okay on time. And talk a little bit about how this particular number, how the 100-year flows on the Teton River that are used to make this new floodplain, where those flows came from. So each one of these pieces of this longer section on the flow calculations will have a stop for Q&A. We can also take questions along the way as well. So it's definitely a pretty technical journey how you get to these flows. We've done our best to put some of this information on these slides and help summarize it in this amount of time we've got. But of course, we're always welcome or open to follow up or further questions if we don't get to the bottom of it in this meeting. So I'll pass this off to Kevin, but when it comes down to how these maps are developed, the way that somebody who's a study contractor like Michael Baker goes about calculating these flows is they start with these standards and guidance that FEMA has established for these different methods for floodplains. So I'll hand it over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, and there's a lot of words on this slide. I'm not going to read through all the words. There's a couple main points I wanted to make about this slide. One, we are doing these studies to support FEMA's program. So because of that, we have to follow, the study contractors in the state have to follow FEMA's guidelines and specifications. And two, there are a number of ways that you can do a hydrologic analysis, which we'll go through here. Depending on the type of data you have and depending on the needs of the outcome of your data, you can choose different methodologies. But FEMA has a preference for which order you should choose. And it basically says if you've got gauge data that's of sufficient record length and it's applicable, you should use that gauge data first and foremost. And then it goes into some other methodologies. It says regional regression equations are a second preference. And then if you don't need a hydrograph and stuff like that. So what we've got up here is direct quotes from FEMA's guidelines and standards. It used to be called the standards back in 2003. And the most current guidance for hydrology that rules right now. So for the past 20 years, FEMA's been consistent that their order of preference is gauge analysis, number 1, regression equation, number 2, rainfall runoff modeling, number 3.
Excellent. So thank you, Kevin.
So which did you use?
We did the gauges.
The gauge.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to spend the next handful of slides unpacking that gauge process a little bit and explaining and hopefully building some confidence in that approach. So that's the sort of first take home, is that we based this 23,000 is the number I'm using to give it a number. It changes a bit up and down the river, which we'll talk about. But where did this number come from? We're going to dive pretty deep into that here. There'll be some numbers, there'll be some graphs, but hopefully it'll be able to be followed along here today. So this is a plot of the gauge record at that USGS gauge of that the formal name is Teton River below South Fork near Choteau. It's not very near Choteau, you got to get up towards the mountains a ways. But at the scale of USGS's gauges that are all over the nation, this one's near Choteau. So There's a lot to unpack. We'll walk through this a little bit, but let me start with the text on the right here. So we need to develop these floodplain maps. Step one is to calculate this 1% flow. So as I've mentioned a few times, where does this red line come from is what we're asking and going to dive into. So this red line is at that 23,000 CFS, cubic feet per second. And we've determined that that's the threshold for that flood that has a 1% chance of happening. There's a couple other lines here. That orange line is what we call the 2%, otherwise known as the 50-year, right? I'm so used to the percents, otherwise known as the 50-year. So that flood is about twice as likely to happen. So you might have a 1% chance of the 23,000, but it doesn't feel like much more likely, but it's twice as likely that you'll see, by this calculation, this 14,600 CFS. And then another line we've shown on this plot is the 10% chance. So that's the 10-year flood. So that's a much more common flood. Obviously, it's 10 times more likely than the 100-year flood any given year. And that's a pretty low value, actually. I talked about how normally the river is 1,000 CFS or less. So it'd be a once in a 10-year sort of event to have a 4,600 CFS, 4,620 event on the Teton River. So diving deeper into this plot, we've got each year on the bottom is one of these bars in the bar chart, and then on the y-axis here is the corresponding flow. So you can see that most of these floods are close to zero. They're quite low. And then you've got the occasional peak. And then, of course, we've got the 1964 event of over 50,000 CFS. That's included in this chart. That is included in the analysis. Big floods are, of course, important, but they're only one source of information. Every single year through here had an impact on the result. If you have, the more low flow years you have, the lower that estimate gets. Of course, having a big flood event is going to increase that estimate, and we're going to talk a lot more about where that value comes from. And feel free to chime in at any point if only you give me a second to have a sip of tea. So the first ingredient in one of these numbers is a gauge. So USGS, in addition to DNRC, but USGS has long been the primary installer and maintainer of these stream gauges. So this is just kind of a cartoon you can find online of some of the different pieces of what a stream gauge measures. And to explain in a little more detail, you've got the station installed at a point that's relatively well behaved, and you have this function, I guess is kind of an elaborate word for it, but you determine a relationship between how deep the water is and that flow, that discharge in cubic feet per second. That's called a rating curve. So for example, what the station is measuring is how deep the water is, 3.3 feet, and then on this plot you can read off that the discharge is 40 cubic feet per second. This is just an example. This isn't specific to the Teton gauge or anything. So they monitor, these stations are recording that depth continuously, more or less, over the course of a year. They keep track of things like if they're iced up. You can go pull that data off the USGS's website at any point. And for that chart that we just had up, that chart represents the highest stage and the highest discharge that's observed every year. So we, when it comes to looking at the statistics that we're gonna get into, we are only talking about what's the highest flood of the year. And it probably wasn't even a flood 99 years out of 100, right? So,
Doug?
yeah,
Can you go back to the other chart?
sure.
Okay, how many years is that on the bottom? Is that 50?
That's a great question. It's pushing 70 at this point. The first year of record is 1948, and at the time of the analysis, they took water years up through 2018.
Okay, now this is just a question. The middle line is 14,000, okay? And it hasn't hit that one time,
Yeah, it got pretty close in 75.
okay?
Yeah.
The other one was a 64 flood, which that was a lot of snow and a lot of rain all in one clatter. So that's the only time it's ever hit the 23,000.
Correct.
So how do you justify going from 14,000 to 23?
That's a great question, and that's what the next slides are going to help
Can you just take
explain.
that slide?
Sure.
Got some questions. So the blue lines are gauge data, and then the grayish are record extension. Can you explain the difference there?
Can I jump in on that? When did the gauges go in? Because off the report for the 964, it was a projected flow. So when did the gauges start recording? The 1964 was a projected 54,600. They estimated.
Yeah, the gauge went out. It wasn't.
Okay, let's keep track of these questions, and we'll come back to them in the Q&A portion. So, record extension, what does that mean? Great question. I have another copy of this slide coming up too, so. And then 1964, and the word for that, or 64 is indirect.
Okay.
Measurement, so we'll talk a little bit more about that.
So I guess along this line also, the next slide you had the satellite and it's being recorded and all that. When did they start that process? Because before I would assume that somebody had to go out and physically look at the gauge.
Yeah, well, and even these, I mean, they might have cell network or something. In earlier stream gauges, they'd actually have a cork method, which was where they'd have some cork and a sort of receiver along the end, and then you'd go out and see how deep the water got then. So yeah, the continuous every minute recording is a newer phenomenon. But essentially, USGS won't publish these results unless they're at a high standard of data. So yeah, the only information you might have in 1948 is that one flow event, as opposed to in a more recent year, you'll have a continuous record.
And on this, does this, okay, so that's a peak. Is that a peak for what period of time? I mean, is that an instantaneous peak? Is that a 1 day peak? A 20? I mean,
I would think of it as a 1 day peak in most cases.
Is that how your model accounts for that? Like, is it?
Okay, yeah.
I mean, because there's a big difference, obviously, if you peak at midnight at some number and then 6 hours later it's half that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We'll come back to that a little bit later.
So another question in regards to that, a lot of these stream gauges are not, they go out of calibration. What do you take into account for that?
That's what USGS is doing with these, basically, is going out and maintaining them. So that costs on the order of...
But I realize that, but they're not calibrating them every day. They're
about every year or two.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but during the course of a season, a year, they can go out of calibration.
well, that's the important thing there is choosing the right site, and that's one of the challenges where USGS doesn't have these gauges every mile up and down the stream. They pick sites that have a lot of hard rock bed or otherwise are a lot more stable. So
they'll generally go out after large flood events too and re-survey it to confirm that the rating curve is still accurate.
Yeah.
They go out after every large storm, and they also do about every 6 weeks. They're taking measurements to make sure that their rating curves are up to their standard.
So just some clarification, I want to go back to Ross's question on record extension. Is that something that we're going to talk about? Because I see a whole lot of gray there, so I want to understand like how that comes about and where that is used.
Well, let's get, so I have
a whole lot of gray.
that slide again here in about 5 slides. So let's step through the basics of where this 100-year flood comes from, and then we can dive into the actual data that went into this analysis. Okay, so to understand this idea that we have a gauge record and we're going to calculate the 1% chance flood, let's use a simple example, the distribution of people's height that isn't dependent on some of these other complicated factors like with a river. So a statistical question you might ask about people's heights is, what are the chances that some random crowd of people in a concert or at the airport or whatever, what are the chances that someone is over 6'6" in that crowd? So you just make a guess, 10%, that seems pretty high, right? Spoiler alert, as the kids say, it's about 1% is the chance that you'll have in a crowd of 100 people or so, someone over 6'6". You might know a guy that's over 6'6", and you say, I'll invite him down, and then that's a 100% chance, right? So in order to answer that question about just a hypothetical crowd of people, you need to start by collecting data on the distribution of how tall people are. So folks may have heard of the normal distribution before, and I'll try to not dwell on it too long, but and this was just a sample image I grabbed online, but if you measured the height of 5 people, 10 people, the whole town of Choteau, you'll probably have an average height of maybe around 5'8" or so if you're sticking to adults. And then as you get further away from that average, people, the heights get less and less likely. So if you've got this average height of, like I said, 5'6", 5'8", the number of people who are in these height ranges is going to get smaller and smaller as you get taller and taller. So you need to start with collecting that data, but in order to answer statistical questions, what if you didn't see somebody over 6'6" in your sample, right? You can still use something like this bell curve to go and pluck that probability off of this function, even if you don't have an observation of somebody over 6'6". So that's the basic idea behind predicting an extreme outlier event. The other thing, using this kind of simpler normal distribution as an example, is that shape of that function in the height example is going to depend on where you go measure those heights, right? Depends on the crowd that you measure. And if you're predicting the heights of people showing up to a Taylor Swift concert versus a Toby Keith concert, probably going to have shorter people showing up for Taylor Swift, right? So this normal distribution is a function with all these Greek letters and things, but there's really only 2 features to the shape of this function: the average, where that peak is, and then how wide it is. So depending on the situation, you can adjust the shape of that function, and that makes a big difference on these extreme events, right? So just kind of a high-level statistics concepts walk through. The actual calculations, you got to dive into books like this and and get into the weeds, but that I just sort of wanted us to get on the same page about what answering a statistical question looks like. And then to take us back to flooding, that normal distribution is just one type of these statistical tools, and the normal distribution isn't a good fit for flooding. You need to account for things like you can't have zero, you can't have negative flow in a river. The distribution that has long been established as the sort of standard in the US especially is this log Pearson type 3. And at its core, it's that same basic process. You're gonna look at a gauge record and tweak these shapes of these functions to say, I've got a function that looks like this gauge record, and I can use it to make determinations of these different 1%, 10%, 2% events. Just wanted to point out that the more data you have, the better. In the flood world, 10 years of gauge record is the minimum that you need in order to, be confident in your answer. And the more data you have, the better. And then, like with the height example, with this method, and with any method really, you don't need to have seen a 1% flood in order to estimate it. So like I said, you only need 10 years, and this is, I think, a very intuitive, or I guess I should say unintuitive way that these statistics work. How can, if you haven't seen this flood before, in the case of that gauge we have, but there's a lot of cases where the 1% flood is a flow that the river hasn't seen yet. But when you've got this methodology built up by looking at a lot of rivers all across the nation, all across the state, similar watersheds, different watersheds, a lot of confidence has been built up in these methods by them being proven right, unfortunately, in cases where they were used elsewhere. So, just a little bit more of the math and guts of how that number is calculated. This is a plot and some of the information that's available in the full, supporting documentation of the hydrology report. Like we said, we've got copies on the flash drives here. But kind of stepping through my bullet points after fitting the distribution to the data, we extract the discharge for the given probability. This is the series of flows at that gauge, and we've kind of flattened out the distribution. I won't get too much into the weeds there. But a couple other key points is so you do this at a gauge site. I said this is the gauge way upstream of town. And so there is a limit to how far upstream and downstream that you can sort of transfer this result, and you scale it based on drainage areas. So I kind of put quotes around distance, so this result can only be used at the gauge site or at a specific distance up and downstream, but that distance isn't about river miles, it's more about the upstream and downstream, or it's more about how much the drainage area has changed relative to that gauge site. So each of these calculations are available for review and are part of the study material. And when it comes to calculating that 23,000 CFS, it is this, with these statistical methods being complicated and needing a lot of review and a lot of double checking. We have USGS calculates it originally. We have, in this case, Michael Baker review those calculations, fold them into the rest of the floodplain study, which we'll talk about more in a second. DNRC is reviewing that along the way. FEMA is reviewing that along the way. And that's just in order to agree on that 1% event, which is, of course, because it has big consequences and it's a really important value that needs a lot of rigor and review. Yeah.
Just a question.
Sure.
Depends on the drainage area. So what do you take into account? Does any of the absorption rate go into that?
That's a good question. Yes and no. And in this case, this is something we'll get into in a moment. When you have another gauge downstream, then you've got sort of two endpoints that you can vary in between. And so that you're getting at something that's a big topic of the rest of the slides, for sure.
So you're using one gauge?
No. Not in this case. We're just using, this is the example.
Two gauges?
For the Teton River between, there's actually a third gauge. I forget what that one's called. But the Strawberry, yeah. And then, but yeah, for as far as focusing in on the Teton River through Choteau, you've got the Dutton gauge downstream and then this gauge upstream that are kind of these fixed points.
The 23,000, are you saying that's at the South Fork gauge?
Yeah, that's only at the South Fork gauge. And then we touched base on this in the February meeting a little bit, but the Dutton gauge, even though the drainage area has increased a lot by that gauge, the 1% estimate doesn't increase a whole lot, and that is essentially the way that you account for all of these factors between the two gauges. But we're going to get more into that in a bit.
So when you said you, quote, normalized or flattened, tell me more about that. You said you flattened the data.
Oh, this just, you could repurpose this to make it look like the normal distribution, but that makes it harder to visualize when you're doing this work. So, yeah, I don't know how. It's a bit of a silly concept, but the shape of this is. So
you're saying the data points would be further apart?
No, this is about this x-axis. So that first, those normal distributions that are a little bit more intuitive, it gets lower and lower, rarer and rarer as you get further out. This is about the probability that it's going to be exceeded, so it sort of adds up as you go. I could sketch out a visual or something to help with that, but yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you probably can't tell, but both axes are plotted logarithmic, which will make it more of a straight line, but there is, you'll see a little skew to it. It's an upward skew. So another thing that goes into the calculations is you look at gauges across the region, and generally the multitude of gauges will have the same skew if they're from the same hydrologic region. So you'll take a generalized skew, combine that with this gauge's skew to inform how that line is not only fit to all the points, but bends either slightly up or down or is flat.
So you're saying you can skew it however you want?
No, the skew map is created by somebody else who does, it's not part of this study, it's done independently. So there are skew maps of Montana that if you're going to do this analysis, you use, and the USGS develops those skew maps.
Yeah, it's not skew, it's not the sort of more general definition of the term skew. To give you more of a visual, back in these distributions, we say that I said they have two parameters. They've got the center and they've got the width. And so skew is just what we call the third parameter. What that means is that these have to be symmetric on either side of that middle, because that's a simpler shape if you've only got two dials to dial. But a distribution like this that's asymmetric, you have that third factor that we call the skew in statistics, but it isn't something that, as Kevin said, we can skew like you normally use the term. So I want to get back to a couple of these other questions. We have a Q&A slide coming up, So we'll come back to this slide since that was what a lot of the questions were about, but I think a few of them will be answered by the portion Kevin's about to cover. So that was a quick overview of how you take a series of peak flow observations and get these statistics out of that. If you don't have a gauge or data for a specific river, this gets back to the FEMA guidance sort of hierarchy. You can only make an educated guess, maybe based on a similar river, and that's going to be much less accurate than observations of a specific river.
So would you characterize this as having a lot of data or not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not super uncommon for Montana, but yeah, as we mentioned, that 10-year cutoff we hit pretty often. We've only got 11 years of data, 12 years of data, and those are important factors in the rest of the analysis. So this is a pretty a really large gauge record as far as these things go.
In your modeling, did you use all of that data, or could you use only the blue stuff?
You do use all of it, yeah, and that'll be part of that record extension, which we'll talk about in a second. So yeah, we've got just a couple slides. Let me spool through them. So we'll have another formal sort of Q&A break, but I'll come back to that slide. So yeah, Kevin is gonna explain a bit. We talked about determining this 23,000 at that gauge, but we model the whole Teton River. So where does that come from? Sure.
Yeah, so Doug had mentioned that the USGS actually did the flood frequency analysis at all the gauges. And then after they did it, it went through review from the state, from FEMA. We reviewed it, Dowell Engineering reviewed it. Once we all felt comfortable that it was done correctly, then Michael Baker took over the study to develop discharges for areas that didn't have gauges or weren't immediately adjacent to gauges. So if we're talking the reach of the Teton River through Choteau, what we did is we looked at both the Dutton gauge, which is downstream, and the South Fork gauge, which is upstream, and everywhere there was a major tributary that came in, we put a flow node upstream of that tributary because the drainage area changes. And the USGS has developed an equation, which is shown here. It's actually, it looks like a very complicated equation, but it's easier than it actually looks. Or it's not as menacing as it looks. But it's essentially looks at the ratio of drainage area at that gauge or at both gauges versus the drainage area at the flow node. So what we did, if you flip, is we actually created 15 additional flow node locations moving upstream from that Dutton gauge. So you can see the Dutton gauge, the 100 years in blue, was almost 27,000 CFS, and as you work up the watershed, it decreases down to that 23,000 CFS at the South Fork gauge. So we're not applying that larger watershed Dutton gauge for the entire Teton River. We're ramping down that discharge as we go upstream.
So I have another question.
Sure.
Because Deep Creek comes into the Teton, but it's south of town.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What's the volume there? I think if I remember right, it's 9,000.
We could take a look. We created a online map where, when we're done doing the formal presentation, we can look at details like that and we can pull it up. But I don't have that.
But I mean, that's going to skew the number at Dutton.
Yeah, so let me maybe sketch a quick line here that I think will help. So because this is a really important point, and I think will help understand help get at a lot of the questions that we've discussed so far. So now that we've got these two gauges to think about, we've got the Dutton, we've got the South Fork. These flows increase as you go downstream. So we've got South Forks is 23,000. I'll just use 23 here. And then 26.8 thousand is the flow at Dutton. So, and then the drainage area, you know, this is there's a lot of small numbers on this table.
110.
Is 110 at 23 square miles. And then
1,200.
Dutton is 1,200?
Mhm.
Wow. Yeah, not to, that's a huge change. 1,200 square miles, which if this was any sort of to scale, it would be, okay, I'm gonna do one more quick chart here too. River miles, and the same axis here, the drainage area. So, so essentially, that equation that Kevin was saying is less intimidating than it looks. I mean, this plot's actually kind of boring. It's just a straight line. As the drainage area increases between these two fixed points, you need to calculate these things called flow nodes. So I'm going to go back one slide. The details on this figure are a little hard to see in the room here, but when you have these two gauges, we've got that 23,000 at South Fork. We don't necessarily say, well, 23,000 is the flow up until you get to the next place we have measurements. We assume that that 1% flow is increasing between these two points where we have measurements. And that's an important distinction, I think, versus how a lot of us go into these things picturing these models and assumptions. We also aren't taking a 23,000 CFS flow and like piping it in here and then modeling it down the river. We do that for a while, but exactly like you're saying, when you have a big change in drainage, you update that amount of flow and you simply just bump up the model accordingly. So we might need some time to dive into that in some more detail, but let's step through this real quickly. So I think this will help a little bit where, so I guess maybe this won't help a whole lot, but the idea would be when you want to go place a flow node, you read the drainage area off of this plot, and you know, for a while you might not have a new drainage until you get to something like Deep Creek, where I think we looked at this last time. It's almost double. So you know, my apologies if this kind of quick sketch didn't work out quite like I thought. But you have a drainage area, and that's what this table's getting at. Is, you know, this is probably above Deep Creek. You have 220 square miles, and you've got this flow here that, let's say, maybe is 23.5, right? And then once you jump down to Deep Creek, which is the next one down, you might have a huge increase in drainage area. In fact, you do. So that might get you up to 800 square miles, okay? So, so then you have to use this line essentially to go pull those values. So, so that's what these values along the way here are dictating. And then you can see, I mean, you can't see, but I can see a big jump here. And you know, these nodes just have kind of an index name. And in some other charts that are in the report, if you go digging, we more clearly delineate where these other drainages pick up. But if you have a big jump in the flow, that's because you had a big increase in drainage area. You know, it's essentially similar to the example I just laid out. So yeah.
I'm just going to throw this out there. You're telling me that between the South Fork gauge and that Dutton gauge, you're only gaining 4,000 CFS and you've got Deep Creek and Muddy, all that whole area dumping into there?
Yeah.
I don't buy that.
Yeah,
You
no,
got
that's,
10 times the area,
yeah,
and you're only gaining 4,000 CFS.
yeah,
If
no,
you-
and that's,
If you draw around your map from the South Fork gauge, that drainage, then you look at the rest of the drainage, and the rest of the drainage is only gonna have 4,000 CFS, that defies common sense.
no, that's, I mean, I see exactly where you're coming from, but in fact, that's exactly what you guys have all been telling us about, is we call that flow attenuation. So the loss is due to groundwater. The fact that, you know, the river's rushing out of the mountains up at South Fork, and then it flattens out through here. When you've got the gauge down here, you do these two analysis, like that's sort of what we expected, right? If we hadn't seen that, we'd have been confused. But the Dutton River results of, you know, the gauge at Dutton said 26,000 is the 1% you'd expect. So even though you're picking up all of that drainage area, I mentioned this on the February call, the difference is you might have a much longer duration flood down at Dutton. There might be a higher total volume of water. These flows are an instantaneous snapshot of the cubic feet per second going by one point in the river. So that's another complication. We've had examples that got presented on an AM/FM. Well, we lost Brian at this annual conference earlier this year. There was an example from the Clarks Fork and Yellowstone where the 1% actually decreased a little bit as drainage area increased. So if you have the gauge data, you don't dispute it when you're in our position, but it's actually, in my opinion, perfectly capturing all of these dynamics that you guys are talking about. You have this huge increase in drainage area. You don't have a proportionate increase in the flow rate because of, just like I said, all these things, all these issues that you guys have been bringing up.
And it's actually pretty common for this to happen in this exact scenario where you're coming out of the mountains and you've got a large discharge and then it flattens out significantly. So if you look at a similar situation in Utah or Colorado, we see this exact thing. You just, that water slows down so much and gets stored in the larger floodplain when it's not confined that it, as Doug mentioned, it attenuates as you, even though you're adding a lot of drainage area, the flow that originally came down, it almost stores in that floodplain since it gets so flat.
But in our last meeting, when Peter brought that up, you guys said you wouldn't take that into consideration.
So that is something that John's going to be covering in a few slides. And just to not punt on it too much, what we meant by that is it's the gauge data that has taken this into consideration. We don't actually come up with a number for how much flow gets lost along the way, and John's going to talk about that in a little more detail.
So another way I would say that is because you have actual real world data coming from these gauges, that's why it's the highest priority of the methods to be used. Because it takes, then you don't have to try to take all these other, like Peter was talking about the swamp, you know, taking out a big chunk here or this piece over here or a gravel pit or something like that. The gauges, because they're measuring over time, have taken that into account. And that's why, like Doug was saying, you see that flattening. Sorry, I come from a dam safety background, that's the way I think. So in a dam breach, you see this same thing, you know, big flow water from one spot, and as it goes downstream, that peak goes down and down and down. It doesn't mean there's a lot less water coming out, it's just kind of, it's flattened itself out.
We have
broadened
additional
out, slowed down.
tributaries coming in. That's
Right. But and this is what I'll get into, there is a method to take that into account and kind of build that. But on the whole, it's a lot less accurate than using the real world gauge data.
And a quick thing I'll add about the additional tributaries coming in, a really important assumption that goes into the statistics of this is something we call independence and whether things are independent from each other statistically. So when you have a flood on the Teton River, the Deep Creek, for example, might be pretty high, probably. It's probably a wet year, but Deep Creek isn't necessarily having its 1% flood at the same time that the Teton River is. So it does contribute to the flow as you go past Deep Creek, but other than some rare exceptions where two watersheds are side by side and experiencing the same weather patterns and likely flooding at the same time, you don't assume that every single tributary along the Teton River is contributing its 1% flood as you pick up that extra drainage. So, and all of that nuance is really hard to account for if you don't have this gauge data. But when you have this gauge data, it gives you all the information you need about the dynamics as you go from that South Fork gauge to the Dutton gauge.
But if you're taking that into consideration, in my mind, the flood risk in Choteau would be something less than the South Fork gauge number because it's 20 miles downstream. It's the same argument in my mind.
Well, it does. I mean, essentially what you're accounting for is those small drainages are going to contribute some. And so if the Dutton gauge had showed something like that, or if we had an extra gauge that we could have plopped right by Choteau and it showed a decrease in the 100-year, then I would agree. But from my point of view, having done a lot of these types of analyses, the flow is pretty flat. So I think this 89.2 of 23.8 is the actual flow in the model through Choteau. So that's only 800 more CFS. So essentially you're right. And while it didn't go down, it's the fact that it stays flat is accounting for all of that relatively flat. And you know, the best information that we have about how flat it is having that next gauge downstream at Dutton.
But just to be clear, all of that discussion is derived from picking two endpoints, and those endpoints are contrived or calculated. So that 23,000 is not measured. That 26,000 is not measured. That's not measured.
No, the 23. No, those are
contrived. They're created.
Yes.
With your models.
Yes.
And then everything else is backed into from those 2 points.
Yeah. It's those
so
numbers.
What you just walk me through is these nodes, and the nodes. Then you put them in there. You do some streamflow measurements, and then the area above that you just take proportional. But it's all based on using those as your baseline.
Exactly.
And everything else flows from that. So so the issue is not. I mean that's a fine discussion, but the reality is it's driven from that 23 and that 26.
Exactly. Yes.
But you take that chart right there, and nothing has ever hit that 23.
Well, except for 1964.
Well, yeah, but that's 70
Well, we're
years
going to
ago.
talk about that, right?
Basically.
Well, so I wanted to come back to this and talk about a couple of those points. But yeah, go ahead. Someone was saying.
Basically, you've thrown the chart out and you've mathematically created your own CFS. Basically.
Well, I mean, if we didn't have this data, we wouldn't have used this approach either. We'd probably use something more like what John's going to talk about. But let's talk a little bit more. So yeah, I mean, as far as the best we can explain today, this is how those numbers are determined. And I wanted to touch on a couple other things. We're actually doing pretty good on time. So let's go through the questions that we punted on. So we were asked about the record extension. So that is a relatively recent sort of additional sophistication to this method. It's you know, a lot of folks a lot smarter than me put together books like these to come up with these approaches, but these gray lines that include a record extension essentially say if you have another gauge downstream, you do some conversions to say, well, we didn't have the gauge installed here for this year, but we can confidently populate an estimate of that peak flow during these years that are gray. So the blue years are the only years that have an observation at that gauge. And before that, raises some alarm bells, most of these years that were added to the analysis actually lowered this estimate of the 100-year because they were small years. So it's just a amalgamation of the gauge data that you have available in the area to make sure that you're not ignoring a big event that you know about downstream, and that you're also not throwing out all of these years that you know there was no flood. So the addition of these years, for lack of a better framing, certainly lowered that estimate of that flood.
Is that data that you guys came up with, or the USGS came up with?
USGS.
Okay, so I mean, that's stuff they dug out of their old records and stuff?
So there's a way to correlate records from since there's two gauges on the stream, to correlate those two. So you essentially look at the flow records where you've got the records for the same year at both locations and kind of compare them for all the years you've got those two flow records, and then you can populate the missing records.
Yes.
And all of this, so this is the old book. This is called Bulletin 17B. The new one is Bulletin 17C. And this was created by a subcommittee of hydrology experts that included the USGS and Federal Highways and the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA and others that specify down to a T the techniques that you should be using for this flood frequency analysis, and the technique and when you are allowed to extend a gauge record, and how you deal with historic peaks and low outliers and high outliers. So the book addresses all of that.
So I guess my question is, so I look at the South Fork gauge daily.
Yeah.
And so if I go in and search, say I want to search the period 1971, or I mean all of 1975.
Right.
I can't pull it off their website, but it gives a little disclaimer that other records may be available at the local office. So is all that, then records that are supposedly there, is that built into this or not?
Not likely. I think maybe a good way to picture this is some of these, I don't know for sure without looking into it, but some of these probably came straight from the Dutton gauge.
Right.
So if the Dutton gauge was in
So I
place
guess
for some
that's a
of
good
these
point.
years- Yeah. So if you've got the Dutton gauge, this gauge was not active for this period, which we'll get into the indirect, by the way. But if the Dutton gauge is active, then you know something about what the river's doing during that period. So that's the basis behind it. And our Seth Sievkin at the USGS, who was originally going to be involved in this discussion and did the thrust of this work, just to kind of put a finer point on it, as Kevin alluded to, if it hadn't been Seth doing this, somebody else would have followed the same methods and gotten the same result.
So back to Ross's question here, if that is the Dutton data, or so we get a weather event up Geek Creek, we get a weather event up Blackleaf or something, that's going to send a large amount of water into the Dutton gauge that...
Yeah, so it's not the Dutton data. They didn't take the Dutton flow rate and put it at this gauge. They used a specific technique that's called Move 3, where you have to go through a comparison of those two gauges when you have two records at the same time and see how they compare, and then they take a flow rate from the missing year, or from a year you got it at Dutton where you're missing it here, and you apply an equation to essentially shrink that discharge a little bit so it applies to the South Fork.
That doesn't account for that coming from somewhere else.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
that's part of the analysis. Seth spent months doing this stuff.
It's impossible.
Well, yeah. So if they suspect that a year is impacted by some other drainage and is irrelevant, then
How would they suspect
they'll
that?
throw it out.
What kind of intimate knowledge would they have to suspect that?
I mean, if there's a news report, it's all sorts of, they do a very comprehensive dive into all of the available data. For Seth Siepkin could tell you more about flooding in Teton County than probably anybody in this county, at least back when he was doing this project. So if there had happened to be an anomaly that snuck through, that can happen. But I'll also reiterate the other point where primarily bringing in the Dutton gauge information lowered this number. It would have been higher if they hadn't done that. So it's about taking in as much information as you can. It's a really important question, but there's not a lot of judgment that goes into it.
So do you also take into consideration the weather, changing in weather?
That's a great question. If we knew more about how the weather is going to change, we would. But because we can't be very confident in that, we only look backwards at the data that's happened. And so it's not really something that's feasible to do, the change in weather patterns. And you just sort of assume that you don't know enough about the weather in the future to tune the results according to different weather patterns. And as we saw, even if big snowpack years aren't as common anymore, things like what happened in 2022 may be getting more likely. There's all these different forces in play. Sorry, it's a long conversation.
So those gray numbers are all extrapolated numbers from the Dutton gauge?
Not necessarily just from the Dutton gauge, but they're part of this record extension method, yes.
And they're extrapolated there?
Yeah. Like you said, fed through an equation and you get a number. So real quick, we'll talk about indirect methods. So this big spike in the data, that's a really important result, and we have followed up both as part of this analysis originally and as part of the additional deep dive since last fall. How confident does USGS have any reason to worry, I guess you could say, about this indirect measurement? So what an indirect flow rate entails, just like was brought up earlier, sometimes you have a big flood, it blows that gauge right out. So what USGS has done for every major flood, and are still doing across the state, is they go out as soon as they can after the flood, and they take the survey, take the dimensions, they see a high water mark, and they determine the flow that went through there through what we call an indirect method. It's kind of a misnomer because it's very direct. They're actually going out to the site and getting a look at the extent of the flooding. So, so that's where this line is blue all of a sudden in a sea of gray. They didn't have the funding or means to maintain this gauge through this period. And as you can see, there wasn't another very big flood in that period either, except this one where they went out and determined that flow number. So just kind of stepping through the questions there. I don't have a great visual for it, but the last question we wanted to address is about how long that peak is. And that's a really great question. It depends on the river, of course. Like I said, as a rule of thumb, you can assume a peak lasts for about a day. Of course, the very highest peak only lasts for one snapshot of the gauge. But when you look at a typical spring flood hydrograph, for example, those peaks usually span 1 or 3 days, which isn't very long, but it's long enough to assume that the river is flowing at that rate long enough to sort of equilibrate, and we in our model of how the mapping goes, we keep the model at that flow rate constantly. We don't attenuate the flow in the model. We keep it steady, which is conservative. Unquestionably, yes. It's a conservative assumption, but it's not overly conservative if you assume those peaks last a few days, which they usually do, and you don't have any information to assume how short that peak was if you're going to try and say, well, this is too conservative. We need to model a shorter flood. We need to show some attenuation. That isn't something, when you're developing these floodplain maps, that you have enough information to justify doing, as much as objectively taking a peak flow and just assuming that it's constant over the span of your model is the most conservative assumption in that regard. It's not overly conservative from, an understanding of how these floods tend to behave. I don't know if you want to add some things to that, Kevin, or?
I think you explained it about as well as you could.
So I guess I'm not sure I agree that data is not available. I mean, I think you can look at USGS, those stream flows, and you can see it by the hour, and you can see pretty significant, I mean, that data is readily available. You could go right now. So I guess how come we're taking, since we're focused on one hand, we're focused on, we have to, we're using all these methods, best available information, blah, 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 and yet information, I don't know how far back it goes, but I've looked at it back to 2010, and it does show the hourly rates, and it does show that these things aren't lasting for days, they're lasting for hours. So how come that isn't accounted for? Because that has a big implication when you're saying, if I say the data is suggesting, the data that you're just telling me is golden, if the data is suggesting it lasts for 4 hours, but we have to take a 3-day approach, I'm not sure I agree with that. Why is that?
I mean, I think that's a fair point. I think we'll maybe talk a little bit more about that in the sort of next steps period. So I've got a note to circle back to that.
Peter's trying to jump in and bring in another point.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Great. So I'm Peter Fish. I'm the Teton River Water Commissioner. I am the person who brought up the stream loss issue between the South Fork gauge and the town of Choteau. I guess I've been listening to the discussion. I've been on the road here through Helena. I'm going to lose cell service if I go any further, so I'm sitting and listening. And my question is, number one, have you guys read the Teton River Water Study conducted by Aaron Fiaschetti and Eric, I forget his name? It was about a 10-year, 12-year long study of stream flow dynamics between the mountains and Choteau, and in my estimation, documented pretty clearly a significant amount of loss into the groundwater aquifer in a normal year. Just to give you an example, in a normal year with 70, let's say, most of our work is low water, not high water. So, again, we'd be in the position of extrapolating, but 70, 80 CFS at the South Fork gauge will completely disappear into the ground before it gets to town. And possibly with slightly less flows, might disappear into the ground more than once. And with that clear documentation of stream loss, which one has to assume extrapolates into what's being referred to as the swamp south of the river channel, which is where during the two recently observed floods in 2018 and 2019, we saw a significantly different flow dynamic, 2018 being preceded by normal conditions, 2019 following on the heels of 2018, we experienced more significant flooding impacts in town in 2019 with less than 30% the peak flow at South Fork gauge than we did in 2018. I believe it's something in the neighborhood of 12,000 CFS in 2018 and 3.5 in 2019. I personally was in a position to eyewitness much of this dynamic. I raised all that and was told that the stream gauge that the state installed prior to those two flood events had not been around long enough to take those flow readings into account. And granted, those flows were never actually documented because nobody saw fit to do so, unlike the South Fork gauge, which didn't record flows. Those peak flows were extrapolated. And I suggested, why not do that extrapolation to get at least a ballpark idea of what those flows look like at the Spring Hill gauge. Because at the very least, it might provide enough evidence to undermine the assumption of 100+% flow transport from South Fork to our weak spots around town. Based on my observations, that assumption of 23,800, 23.8 showing up at town when 23 is up at South Fork can't be right. It just cannot. And I don't know what the right answer is, but I am curious if you guys have done anything to grapple with the data that we do have available to us. I understand it would take some work on the part of the DNR to come up with some reasonable amount of accuracy on all of that, but it seems to me misguided to just ignore it.
Thank you, Peter. I think we'll be able to speak to that a little bit in our next section that John is gonna step us through. So maybe let's dive into that in the interest of time. And I think we'll be back to Q&A after a few minutes on that. So John's done a little bit of looking into the capacity for absorbing losses in the reach. And otherwise, I guess there's only a couple slides, so I can be your Vanna White if you need me to.
Yeah, we only got 2 slides on this one.
Oh, a question online? Sure, can we hold that question online for just a few minutes until we get to through these next couple of slides? Is that from the mayor? Okay. I'll read that question in the meantime. And Peter, your question as well, we'll get to it in a bit here.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't handle people behind me, so. All right. So what Doug asked me to talk about was this kind of the third method of modeling or development of the hydrology for these things. We call it the third method because it is lowest on the totem pole. It's the one we have to go to when we don't have gauge data. We're struggling with regional regression equations, things like that. So what the rainfall runoff method is it's that model you guys are thinking in your head. It's taking the topography and you're putting a storm on top of it and trying to figure out what's coming down through those rivers and streams. This is the type of modeling that does start to get into looking at attenuation by different soil types, different land cover, different things like that. It may seem more intuitive, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Water goes downhill, gets bigger as it goes downhill. But with the number of different variables that you kind of are trying to put into this model to reflect these things, your accuracy starts to degrade. So you're having to make a whole lot of guesses on these things to try to get them to go. I forget what's on this slide. Okay. So this is what it looks like in the computer program. You break it up in these different basins. Some might be mountainous, some might be out of the plains, some might be, you're thinking Muddy Creek or up the Teton or Spring Creek, whatever it may be. It's great for throughout the DNRC. We do different types of this model for different things. I worked at the DNRC a long time. I've worked in water rights. I've worked with dam safety. Worked with floodplain. I've been all over. There's really 3 different tiers of water that we look at when we're trying to do this. So on the water rights side, which Peter works with, our folks in water sciences work with, those are kind of the low flows. Those are the things that we're worried about if we're gonna get water out on the fields, whether we can water our hay. So we're looking at how much water is that gravel swallowing up as it comes out of there? How much is being diverted by somebody? You know, even to the point, sorry, I lost my thought there, or how much is stored in the reservoir or something like that. On the next level, we start talking the floodplain level. That's kind of like that, let's say 10-year event, you know, a pretty good sized flood, something you're talking in the range of that 2018 event. Or, and up to, let's say, that 500-year event. Something that getting in the range of the 1964 event or the 2022 floods in Yellowstone. You know, these big things. The other one we work with there is on the dam safety world. That's 500-year to the biggest storm you can think of possible. And that's what we design dams for. So I wanted to give that scale because it plays into how we develop these models. So in the DNRC, when we're looking at water rights stuff and we're developing, let's just on the Teton River as it goes down, we'd absolutely be looking at, okay, what does this gauge data look like at the South Fork? Okay, what's it look like as it's progressing downstream? Oh, we're losing, let's say 50% to the gravels in the stream bed as it's going down. Well, that's easily measurable. As that progresses downstream, you'd start to model, okay, how much is coming from, I'm going to do Muddy Creek. Is that the big one that comes in just downtown?
That's Deep Creek.
Deep Creek, sorry. Too many Deep Creeks in Montana. So as that progresses, that's getting additive and you're taking water out of that. So that's where we would start taking into account that we're talking about when you start to drop off flows at a Deep Creek. When we start to get into the floodplain realm, these bigger flows, what we notice in these models is you really have to start taking or eliminating that infiltration as it goes down. So you're looking at it, and what happens a lot of time, you get these big flood events, there's precursor rains, there's other, these aren't just like this, well, sometimes they're a single storm event, and that might be this, but a lot of them are not. The 2022 floods in Yellowstone were not like this, oh, we had a cloudburst, and it went downstream. So they're charging the aquifers, they're filling everything up, they're filling up what little reservoirs they have. So all of a sudden that water has nowhere else to go, so that infiltration is gone. And that's kind of what you guys are talking about between the 2018 and the 2019. I totally understand what you're saying. If there was a good-sized event in 2018 and those gravels were dry as a bone and it was kind of this single big push out of the mountains, it probably did swallow a pretty good chunk of that event. And then 2019 came around, if those gravels weren't dragged down there right to the brim, yeah, that water is just going to skate over the top and come down with not a lot of attenuation. So as we look at these and the models that I've done in the past, and I'm kind of speaking from dam safety, when we try to get them to react like what the basin is doing, we've got to turn that all the way off sometimes when we get to these bigger flow events, because that's what the gauge data is telling us, is that water isn't attenuating as it's coming down. It's not being swallowed up by something. It's already full. And or other ones we've seen, it is frozen. The other big part about these models that you're doing, what are we calibrating these models to? What are we comparing them against? It's the gauge data. So we don't just build these things like, oh yeah, this is how it goes, this is what's coming down. Like, we have to have some real world data to tie this to make sure the darn thing's working correctly. So again, we go to different gauge data. But if we got a gauge like that South Fork gauge right there, great. We can see what's coming out. We can look downstream what's going on with the Dutton gauge. Okay, we can kind of play with this and see. We're going to take a specific flow event. Okay, how's that all? Or we're going to play in those parameters in the model to make that close in on that. To say, okay, it's operating correctly. Now we can move it up or down with different flows. So I probably just poorly explained that, but The other, if we use this method, the other thing we'd be sitting here discussing and kind of going over, what storm event would we be looking at? There's a whole bunch of different storm types out there, different events and how they come down. You know, would we be talking about, is it just one cloud burst over a 50-mile area somewhere way upstream that's coming out and it's getting, as it comes down, it's kind of attenuating out a little bit? Or is this one of those big events like 2013 in Colorado where you had this huge Gulf storm just come and sit for days and days and days and just pour rain on the area? And so that there was no way for that water to attenuate. So it just came out and destroyed a lot of stuff in that particular case.
But aren't you already making that assumption with the other method? I think in several meetings we've had before, the discussion has been, well, we have to make an assumption about what that storm looks like. So by definition, you already are. You may not think you are, but you are actually already assuming a certain profile of a storm for your formulas to work.
You're not wrong there, but if I would rephrase our assumption as we're assuming that the gauge record is an adequate representation of the flood risk going forward. So we don't do any, we don't plug in into any of these calculations how many inches of rain, what the snowpack was, what the soil moisture was. None of that goes in when you're doing the gauge record. So it is, but you know, I'm not going to hide what our assumptions are.
Using some very conservative assumptions to say this is the profile of what this would look like.
Well, I mean, it's conservative, but it's data driven. So that, I mean, it's an assumption that I'm comfortable with to say the gauge record going back to 1964 is an accurate depiction of, you know, the height of the crowd of people that you might expect next year to show up. The types of peak flows you'll expect to see on the Teton River are represented in that gauge data. If it turns out that the climate shifts, that the weather pattern shifts, another 100 years goes by and we don't see a flood anything like 1964, then if you did the analysis again, you'd get a much lower estimate for the 100-year flood. Maybe you'd say we don't want to factor in that 64 flood anymore, but you would need to be that far in the future to start to be confident that the weather patterns have shifted in such a way that it changes the flood risk. And that's not something that when we're developing these maps for right now, this gauge data is the best data we have available. And like I said, the key assumption is that the types of, you know, that the hydrology is the blanket term for that, is going to be static over time. And while that sounds like a big assumption when it comes to a year after year mindset, if you start talking about decadal time scales or longer, it does tend to average out. Again, that's based on looking at how different watersheds behave all over the nation and the world. So I'm just sort of throwing that out there that's how I would summarize what our assumptions are, and they are assumptions that I'm comfortable with professionally, but I understand it's not necessarily the case for everybody.
I would simplify that a little bit.
Please.
Gauge data has a whole heck of a lot less assumptions than trying to do a rainfall runoff model. There's a lot of things you're having to do, a lot of guesswork on this. Even, you know, back to the storm events, the last one I did of these for a dam project, we spent $100,000 trying to figure out what storm we were even going to design to. And what is one of the storms that we have to design for? 64 up here. That is one of the storms we look at. Springbrook Creek, I forget what year that one is. Colorado is the other one. So these are real world storms that we work on in there. But that we're still making an assumption there on how that storm will come in and what it would look like. The gauge data takes a lot of that out of it. It's using measurements from the streams. And again, we would just go back and have to calibrate to that data because it's that real world. If we use these methods. So I guess and what I'm trying to convey with this is the reason we don't use these things. This is the reason we use them in water rights and things like that, to get a good idea of what's going on with the stream system. But when we're talking these bigger events, there's too many other factors that go in, and so that gauge data is the one that is the highest priority to use.
So what was the gauge data for 64 and 75 at the South Fork Bridge?
64 was 50 something. Yeah, that
54,600.
Oh,
That came from a gauge, because you're using gauge data, but you're also using wild guesses for 64 and 75, and you're kind of muddling. And if you're going to use, just take those gauge data, the blue on the right-hand side, use that if you're going to use gauge data, but you're guessing on 64 and 75.
64 is not a guess. What it means by the indirect is they would actually, and I've done this in the field, and it works really well. Is they went out and surveyed that cross section. They knew the depth of that. They knew that cross section, and so you can tell how much water has come by that. And that's why the USGS goes out immediately after a flood. Same with 2022 floods in Yellowstone. They were out there marking those high water marks, measuring those cross sections, so you could calculate what that flood, the flow rate of that flood. So when he says indirect things like that, they were out there doing that. It might not be that it was the cork inside the gauge, or I forget what the old measurement devices with the little wheel of paper.
So I want to jump in real quick. We're getting up towards 3. I think we can go a little bit over 3. That's no problem. I want to jump on a couple of things for the online folks in particular. So Peter, thanks for your question. We may not be able to dive much deeper into it today. We do have Todd Blythe on the call, and I won't necessarily put you on the spot, Todd, but he is from that sort of water sciences side of the house at DNRC. I think he's worked with you, Peter, quite a bit in the past. And in case Todd wasn't going to be able to make it today, I think we sort of made sure to discuss a bit with Todd before today. And in a nutshell, one of the important things that Todd pointed out in terms of differences between that water sciences group, their work, and our floodplain work is just these regulatory frameworks, and that'll be something we'll circle back around to soon here. So we have these FEMA regulations and guidance and standards that we're following, and other work, Peter, like the work that you mentioned that the Water Sciences Group does, is under a completely different regulatory framework. It's another big Byzantine regulatory framework, of course. So Todd, I just wanted to see if you wanted a chance to add anything, or speak to that more directly. Like I said, not to put you on the spot, and in either case, thanks so much for hopping on today and listening in.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I don't really have too much to add. I can address some of the things in your comment, like measuring high flows at our Spring Hill gauge is like say in 18 and 19 was actually not possible for a direct measurement. We would have actually had to do what the USGS does and do an indirect, because we can't get instrumentation across the channel when it leaves its banks there. It becomes this half-mile wide beast that goes out through the cottonwoods. And that's why we have not recorded any of those peak flows at that specific gauge site. In terms of the losses from the top to the bottom, it's really hard to say. When you think about that infiltration into the stream bed, there's like these two things that you have to take into consideration, which is the area that the water is covering, which obviously increases when it goes on the floodplain. But then you have to take into account especially the porosity of the stream bed and the floodplain, which dictates how much water can enter the ground in any particular place. And because we don't have peak flows between our gauge and the USGS, we really don't know how the attenuation changes above about 300 CFS, maybe. And I think you mentioned that in your comment, Peter, we'd be kind of extrapolating into that terrain because we don't have any data to inform it. And I think in terms of the regulatory stuff, you kind of covered it, Doug. We don't, we helped USGS in 2022 with a lot of flood mapping and indirects and flood frequency stuff, but it was purely that like science side of it following we had to actually go through very strict data protocols that they defined, and they wouldn't accept anything that we did unless it conformed to their standards and went through several iterations of review from them. So it's a little different world when you start looking at floods, and while we might, produce data, we certainly measure floods at gauges where we can do it. So we are involved in that, and we do indirects. We're kind of really more on the like those science method sides that have been developed by others, rather than the kind of regulatory things that FEMA would say, this is how you need to do this for flood problems.
So this is Peter. Is it possible at this point in time, several years later, to do that to FEMA's guidelines? I mean, we know what the stage height was. I went and pulled those, and they were within 8/10 of one another, 18 and 19. I think it was 6 feet at 18 and 5.2 feet at 19. Is it possible to do that work and find out what the flows were at Spring Hill at this point, or is that not possible?
Are you saying like get a 100-year flood number, or just get like what the discharge in 2018 and 19 was?
What the discharge was in 2018, 2019?
If possible, yeah. We actually, this summer, we started a new direction of indirect Water Sciences Bureau where we're flying LiDAR around all of our gauge sites so that we can actually do these indirect calculations when we can't get out there and measure in a channel like Teton. And then right after a flood or even during the flood, we can go out with survey grade equipment and collect elevations of the water surface, which that's how we would come back and calculate the discharge from the water level height. And I mean, yeah, we have the stage record, so we could use that to pin an indirect. The problem is we'd be using 2024 channel topography, and
I don't think we've had anything approaching flood flows since then. So at that location, I don't think we'd have any issues with that. I mean, essentially all I've been asking is, let's just take a look and see whether or not my eyes were fooling me, or if there is something to what I'm saying, because right now, the assumption is 100% efficiency of transport from South Fork to town, and based on what I saw between 18 and 19, that can't be true in a normal year. If you have an anomalous 2-year event like 18 and 19 was, but that seems to me to be quite rare an event than what we saw in 2018. That's the norm, is, the soil is starved for water, and it is going to absorb in a largely consistent rate. Now, difference between 12,000 CFS and 23,000 CFS, as one of the fellows was alluding to, there's probably going to be more efficient transport, and we are treading into the realm of assumptions, but it sounds to me like from the very get-go, with a lot of these high water flows being indirectly measured, and there's assumptions built into all that, it can't hurt to understand that. And if it takes some of that 100% efficiency of transport off the top of that and changes the 100-year flood flows down at our weak spots closer to town, that could result in a less damaging flood zone map in through town. And that's the only reason why I brought it up, is I hope that there's just as honest an effort to try and figure out the reality of the Teton drainage. Every drainage is different. Between Deep Creek, the main river, and Muddy Creek, they're all three different. Deep Creek is a much more efficient transporter of water from the mountains to town than is the main river, and Muddy Creek may even be worse. That creek goes into the ground completely unless you're getting a major flash of snow melt every year. Within, almost at the foot of the mountains, that creek. Both Blackleaf and Muddy Creek disappear into the ground. They don't show up again above the surface for 20 miles to the east. East to 89 is where you really start to see that creek pop up again. So when you're down at Dutton and you're looking at those flows, all of that idiosyncrasy is lost. You aren't accurately capturing, and then somebody brought up the uniqueness of the events, and I understand that you can only do so much with that, but that 18 rainstorm, we had 6 inches up at the Delrose rain gauge, we had 8 or 9 at the Gleason rain gauge, and you go down into the sun and they were pushing 11 or 12 inches. And so these things, when you get down to Dutton, all that stuff comes out in the wash. And you lose all that uniqueness of each event. And so all I'm asking, because I know you can't capture, like you said, you start chasing rabbits and the thing gets kind of puts it up in knots, and it becomes less useful than it might otherwise be. But the absorption rate of the gravels, the alluvial gravels along the Teton from the mountains to town is a consistent reality that we ought to at least take a look at and see if once we put a number at those Spring Hill gauge, do indirect measuring, whether or not that changes our calculation for town. I'm not second guessing the 23,000 number at South Fork. I just don't know that running from South Fork to Dutton accounts for what happens between South Fork and Choteau.
Hey Peter, this is Doug. Thanks so much for this info. I'm just going to let you know what my note says. How I've kind of summarized your points is that, and I think this hits on a lot of the concerns that have been raised is now that we've kind of got some of this vocabulary from the presentations today, the interpolated flow node approach between those two gauges may not be adequate to capture some of the nuance of all of the different drainages that come in, and that is maybe one way to summarize the concerns. And we're sort of out of time for today, but just as a heads up, if we're hoping to put together some additional material around the hydrology, like I mentioned, to address things we couldn't get to today. So we'll probably sort of encapsulate some of that in that way in order to get back to you on at least some more information for you to see and review later.
Fantastic. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and then the mayor had a question in the chat. I don't think we'll have time to get to that, Mayor, but I just wanted to acknowledge that and summarize it as well. It was, and this was something that got brought up in February as well. Comparisons to the Teton versus the Sun, and we have more data on both, and some flows went up and some flows went down. We didn't get to that today, but I'd like to follow up and provide some explanations there.
How do we do that? Because that was actually one of the points I have. It's counterintuitive. And to me, is it the same model? We're using the same model.
Yeah. So that's the very short version. Is that you don't know how things are going to change or come out. You sort of dive into these methods and river by river, engage by gauge, it can change.
A drainage that's 10x the size of another.
Yeah.
The same assumptions, the same model, the same data, the same methodology, and one goes up 50% using the same model, and one drops 15 to 20%.
No, that's a great question.
that tells me there's an issue with the model. I mean, it doesn't make sense to see that wide variability.
I agree, and I
Because
think
we've
this is a
eliminated
really,
topography, we've already said we're not using that, we've already said we're
Yeah.
not talking about storms,
Yeah.
we're saying it's a model. So how can
Yeah.
a model, taking a 10x sized basin,
Yeah.
in roughly same geographic, same everything, and
Mhm.
yet it changes that much? That's a
I think-
massive swing that I
Yeah.
just can't reconcile.
I think that's a great question, and I think having the Sun and the Teton rivers to compare as an example, I'd like to kind of tease that out and like I mentioned, follow up with some documentation that you can review in a little more detail. I don't have a number or an answer off the top of my head.
Can I ask a clarifying question
Sure.
there? So that, both are based on gauge data, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
So it's not a model that's associated with that.
Okay.
It's just based on the gauge calculation.
But you use a model to get to the
The
PCFX.
mathematics, the statistical model.
The
Yeah.
model to get to your 1% chance is a model.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Or is
I
it just
think
more
there's
calculation?
apples and
It's
oranges.
just a calculation.
I would categorize
Yeah.
it,
It's-
to differentiate between, the floodplain model, which is.
Right, so it's not a model like this, but it's a statistical
It's a mathematical
equation. Yeah,
Mathematical
model.
yeah,
Okay, it's a mathematical equation. All right,
yeah,
cool.
yeah. But either
But
way.
it's the same. I guess
same
that's what
point,
it is.
yeah,
It's the
yeah.
same.
Yeah.
It's the same tool.
Yep. No, and it comes down to some combination of individual events and what was in the record before, and I think we absolutely should spell that out as an example. And I personally don't. It doesn't speak to me. It doesn't throw me for a loop personally, having seen how this plays out and engages all over the state. But it's an absolutely fair question and one we can give you a concrete answer to.
If you threw out the Dutton gauge, you threw out everything aside, and you just looked at the South Fork gauge and you did a model, what kind of flow rate would you have on that?
So it would still be this. I mean, I guess if you throw out the Dutton gauge, I wouldn't know except for that it would probably be higher.
No, I just went through that from 1949 to 2017, 68 years. And I just roughed it out, 67 years times 4,000, and then added the 56,000 and the 12, roughly 12, came out 4,800 CFI on an average.
So, I mean, it doesn't quite work out that way. I mean, so let's go back to this height analogy. We talked about the probability of someone showing up. Well, if you went out and you measured a basketball team's height and everybody was over 6'6", and you want to answer this question, how likely is it someone shows up? You'd say, wow, it's really likely. I think it's almost 100%. So the more data we throw out that isn't that 1964 flood is only going to increase our estimate of what we think that 1% flood is going to be based on the gauge record. So that's that's pretty cut and dry from where I'm sitting. I understand it doesn't quite pencil out, but you gotta be pretty into the weeds to answer a question like you guys have about the Sun River. It's not a simple answer, but it's one we can get to you. And I want to like I said, I think we can stay a little longer and talk next steps, but I wanted to pause and obviously let anybody know if you wanted to head out for your 3 o'clock or whatever. It is 3:15 if folks need to know and be anywhere else. We'll probably have to at least wrap up by 3:30 so that we can get back. But let's go ahead and cover a little bit of the next material we had. I think that was the only question there. Yeah, let's sort of get back to open Q&A after we talk a little bit more about some of these bigger picture updates. So next steps here, we have under the framework of these mapping updates, there's this step called the appeal process or appeal period. This is a formal period that would be probably spring 2025, give or take. We wouldn't know for sure. We'll primarily communicate that through the local floodplain administrators to make sure there's awareness. And that is when appeals can be submitted to FEMA about the technical data. So some things that can constitute an appeal are finding errors in the technical data, or having new or better information. So we're happy to answer more questions about folks who are interested in submitting an appeal. You know, obviously it's our work that's being appealed, so that's a sensitive issue, but we can do whatever's, you know, within our purview to make sure you're not barking up the wrong trees, so to speak, or at least give you our sense of that. So barring that, the maps, at least with this hydrology, are going to continue moving forward. However, we do have a few items that, how I kind of framed it, as being related to the hydraulics, that will have some additional follow-up. So from our point of view, that number in the hydrology is solid. It's not going to change. But there are other items within developing the floodplain maps that have some more flexibility, such as that floodway. So I think folks are probably familiar with the floodway, and if you've reviewed those maps, there's a really extensive floodway on the Spring Creek side of town now, or in these new maps. And we do have some flexibility to reduce that floodway on Spring Creek by increasing the floodway on the Teton River a bit. So that actual elevation doesn't change of that floodplain, but we all know that those floodway zones are more restrictive, and that is something we'll be following up on more soon, more directly with the floodplain administrators, but we'll hopefully have, I suppose, some more concrete updates in time for this May open house. And we'll be following up more on that. So we also did look into the survey and elevation data, because there was concern raised about that data, and we didn't find any errors. But that's at the state of just sort of being a technical document in my inbox at this point, and we'll put together something a little more user-friendly for that. And generally speaking, you know, as far as the flows and these assumptions and some of these concerns, we regardless of how that pans out going forward, we would like to start shifting the conversation, so to speak, towards things like mitigating this flood risk and working on looking ahead to these maps and how those impacts can be mitigated and work with the community as best we can to facilitate that. You know, we're doing these projects all over the state. It's a lot to juggle. Teton has disproportionately really high impacts to your community, and we are aware of that and acknowledge it, and we want to be available as much as we can. And so that's from our point of view where we'd like to spend our bandwidth going forward. But we'll be back in a month and are available for follow-up, and we'll follow up as best we, you know, I don't know if we'll go full press release, but we've got a lot of avenues for getting information out there. So I mentioned working with the floodplain administrators, and that's still sort of our point of contact a lot going forward, but we want to make sure that they aren't the only ones receiving updates either, and I don't know exactly how that'll look on a case-by-case basis, but at least wanted to acknowledge that. So yeah, without further ado, that was a long run-on sentence, but kind of some of the points I wanted to make sure we got out there today. Yeah, we're sort of, I didn't put a question and answer slide here, but we're sort of back to this stage if we want to address a few of the items or circle back to them.
Right when we started, you said that the assumption of the maps going forward would be for the May 29th meeting? What do you mean, the assumption of the maps going forward?
Well, so just, we in any other project that we have, this open house is the same. And the way that it works is we work to make sure every property owner that's encompassed by the new floodplain map gets a notification of this open house. And it's primarily us sitting down and talking about some of the details on people's specific property. Maybe this building is sort of on the edge of the floodplain, and there are tools to demonstrate that your house is above that elevation. It's called a letter of map amendment. So we'll explain processes like those, and so we, while it may still be an ongoing conversation, we don't want the focus of that meeting to be about sort of this hydrology topic, for example, and we also don't want to delay the open house. This was something that we discussed, and the mayor sort of affirmed on that February meeting. Go ahead with the open house. Get out here, see people face to face. Is the plan, and then if there happens to be changes to the floodplain maps down the road, then we can follow up again later. So this May meeting is based on the maps as they currently are. And that's what we'll pull up with individual landowners. So that was a really long answer to your question, but if there are any additional changes after this May meeting, we'll follow up accordingly. But we'll be having this May meeting using those results that got rolled out last fall.
So the meeting in May is just going to be for individual landowners to talk with you about the impact of the map to them specifically?
Yep.
Okay.
What technical data will be accepted for, let's say we want to dispute, or we want to try to gather more technical data to try to get a more accurate risk assessment for the mitigation down the road. So Spring Creek has, let's just say 1,000 CFS flow that can handle right now due to the smaller bridges and culverts, right? Well, can you guys tell me that if we increase it to 10,000 CFS, how much would that reduce our floodway in the area, and how much of that would reduce our floodplain? Or would we, need to build a new river to basically go back to the current floodplain we have right now? So just when we're going forward, what kind of data can you guys provide us on bathymetric surveys? Would that assist us in, because we've got, I'm going to forget their name all of a sudden.
That's a great question. Yeah, so Great West, the contractors who did that hydraulics, they're already looking into a couple of, I guess you could say, low-hanging fruit options like that they see, being a little bit more familiar with the model, and then we're going to have a follow-up conversation so that we make sure we look at examples like that. So we're going to, in this case especially, we're invested in helping you explore those options and do the technical work while we've got Great West on the hook, frankly. So that's our hope. I don't want to overpromise, but that's the plan.
Oh,
so
no, you're recorded. It's now.
Yeah, no, I just,
you're contracted.
well, I just can't. They may look into. There may not be any low-hanging fruit, is what I'm trying to say. I don't know yet, and we're going to know more soon. And we'll follow up. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I didn't end up getting that in the slides here, but that's a part of the conversation going forward for sure.
And then just one last thing.
Sure.
If Chris is still in, he can confirm it, but he has already gotten landowners contacting him stating that they're already getting, that are not currently in the floodplain or floodway, they are already getting hit with insurance. Without the NFIP being accepted, is that accurate? Because I know that the county and the city have not accepted this plan, and we still got to go through the process for the next 2 years, basically.
I mean, I can't really speak to that, but I am aware that an insurer can use whatever information they want to set or require your insurance, or a lender. There is a requirement for flood insurance when you're in the regulatory FEMA floodplain, but that a lender can set their own requirements for insurance in addition to that. So that may be in play, but I can't.
So to clarify that, it's specific to the lender. If you own your house outright, there's no requirement.
That's also very important and very true. There is no, if you own your house outright, even with.
No, I understand that, but it's a federally backed insurance program, so obviously, worst case scenario, they're getting told that they have a loan on their property and they have to take the insurance. But without this being confirmed, and we're still in the initial stages, not even having an open house yet, and landers already being hit with the insurance program, isn't that a little too preemptive of is there something that the landowner could look into by pushing back and waiting until the program is accepted?
I'll just say, generally, that doesn't take place.
Yeah.
As Doug mentioned, a lender can do whatever they want, but generally, you'll only see lenders reach out to homeowners that have a mortgage after the maps go effective, which in Doug's timeline, he mentioned the appeal period would happen in 2025. The maps don't go effective for another 9 months.
Late 2026?
Yeah.
Is the projected.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying is that he's already getting phone calls from landowners that are already being told that their properties will be taking on insurance for flood risk.
I don't want to.
Based off draft data, so I didn't know if you guys had heard of that before, and if there was some way a landowner could fight that, because we definitely aren't in risk this year.
And that is also a Tracy question, as we could call it, so don't be shy to follow up.
I will shoot an email over to her and ask her that question.
Nadine, I saw your hand. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say that was a Tracy question, but she said that sometimes too, lenders can reevaluate their loans, and they do that frequently. But like Doug and John alluded to, lenders can require flood insurance in any zone, even if it's in a low-risk zone. That's up to them, and that's kind of their prerogative.
Okay, thank you.
If they do require it, though, they'll be rated based on the current zone.
Oh, okay, so if they're not actually currently in the zone, they'll be the 500 year, which would not require insurance.
Or would have a lower rate.
It'd have a lower rate.
Lower rate, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, any other questions? We've got a few more minutes certainly, but thanks again everybody for your time. I know this was a lot of information, and it probably, some of it helpful, some of it not, but we at the very least really value these in-person conversations and want you to know that we're available for more questions or concerns. But at the same time, we want to be honest about our assessment of the hydrology, our assessment of the maps, as having no errors or otherwise concerns that are going to hold up the project from our point of view.
So in February, you said you went back and had it. In fact, I took notes on that. You said you went back and had the flow calculations checked.
Yeah.
Was that checked by the same people that created them?
No, yeah. So Michael Baker, these folks and others at their firm created the flows originally, and then another contractor of ours, Dowell, did the review. So and we can provide that review if we haven't already. They put together a report that we can distribute. And also another thing, is just whether or not other methods are worth considering, which is something that comes up from time to time. So that was part of the review as well.
I'll just reach out to you later with an email and stuff and figure out what else we can do, especially since we got economic headwaters and silver jackets coming on board at some point, I think, if that all gets confirmed. So.
Well, we certainly appreciate you coming up in person. That's better than Zoom.
Big time.
Still didn't take away the sting, just so we're clear.
And hopefully you can come back with some answers on some of the questions that were asked.
Absolutely.
And how things were calculated.
Yep. And if you want if somebody's Hulu and Netflix are expired and wasn't here today and is really curious about hydrology, they can watch this recording anytime.
So,
all right. Well, thanks again.
Thanks everybody for coming. So we've adjourned.
Yep.